The universe was full of strange and wonderful things, but Commander Elias Voss had never cared much for sightseeing. He stood at the helm of the ISV Perseverance, watching Relay Station Omega grow larger through the forward viewport, its massive ring spinning slowly against the backdrop of 1,000 distant stars. And he let out a long breath through his nose as the docking clamps locked into place with a deep metallic thud that vibrated through the entire ship. "Docking confirmed," said Torres, his second-in-command, flicking switches on the console without looking up. "Fuel reserves are at 12%. Food stores are basically crumbs, and the number 3 engine is making a sound I can only describe as deeply concerning." "So the usual," Elias said. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the captain's chair and pulled it on over his broad shoulders, the leather creaking as it stretched across his frame, and he ducked slightly as he passed through the corridor hatch, because the ship had been built by people who apparently assumed all humans were 5'6". Relay Station Omega was one of the largest trade hubs in the Orion Spur, a place where dozens of alien species came together to buy and sell and argue and occasionally stab each other over the price of fuel crystals. And humanity had only recently been allowed to participate in any of it. The Interstellar Concord, a coalition of 43 spacefaring civilizations, had admitted humans just 11 galactic years ago, and most of the elder species still treated them like children who had somehow wandered into an adults-only party and refused to leave. Elias did not care what they thought of him, because he had cargo to deliver and a ship to repair, and absolutely no patience for galactic politics. He walked through the docking corridor and into the station's main market ring, and the change hit him immediately. The noise, the color, the smell of 100 alien spice stalls and food vendors mixing into something that was either wonderful or terrible, depending on how hungry you were. The ceiling arched high above, lined with bioluminescent panels that shifted between soft blues and greens, and the floor beneath his boots was smooth, polished metal that reflected the thousands of beings moving through the space like a river of living color. And every single one of them was smaller than him. This was something Elias had gotten used to over the years, but never fully comfortable with, because the galaxy, as it turned out, did not build its people the way Earth did, and most sapient species in the Concord were what a human would call compact. The Crethians were tall but thin as paper, their insectoid bodies looking like they might snap in a strong wind, and the Malvari were squat little fur-covered creatures that barely reached his waist, and the Thesic were elegant bird-like beings with hollow bones and voices like wind chimes, and none of them, not a single species in the known galaxy, were built like a human. Humans were dense, heavy, thick with muscle and bone, forged on a planet with punishing gravity and an atmosphere that was technically classified as corrosive by most galactic standards. And Elias was a particularly large example of the species, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders wide enough to block a standard doorway. He did not think of himself as intimidating, but he noticed the way crowds parted around him as he walked, the way alien eyes tracked him with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked very much like nervousness. On the other side of the market, a young Silithi woman named Kaya Velshara was having the most important day of her life, and she did not even know it yet. Kaya was 23 years old by the standard galactic calendar, barely an adult by Silithi reckoning, and she stood exactly 4 feet and 2 inches tall, with lavender skin that shimmered faintly under the station lights, and large luminous eyes the color of liquid amber. And along her temples ran delicate lines of bioluminescent markings that pulsed softly with her emotions, like a second heartbeat made of light. She was an aspiring xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien species for a living, which meant she had read every single file the Concord had on humans, which meant she thought she knew exactly what to expect. She was wrong. "Kaya, stay close," said her brother Ren, a Silithi merchant captain, who was older and taller than her by exactly 3 inches, and who carried himself with the kind of cautious authority that came from years of navigating dangerous trade routes. This station is crowded, and I do not want to spend 2 hours searching for you again. That happened one time, Kaya said, adjusting the datapad strapped to her forearm. And I was collecting samples, not lost. You were lost. Collecting samples while lost. There is a difference. Ren sighed the particular sigh of an older brother who had long ago accepted that his sister would be the death of him. And they moved deeper into the market, weaving between stalls selling everything from Fesic crystal harmonics to Mulvari fermented root paste. Kaya was scanning everything with her datapad, cataloging species she had only read about, her bioluminescent markings flickering with excitement when she felt it. A vibration through the floor. Not the hum of the station's engines or the rattle of a cargo loader, but something rhythmic and heavy, like a slow drumbeat transmitted through metal, and it was getting closer. She looked up and up and up. Elias Voss walked past her, 3 feet away, close enough that she could feel the displacement of air as his massive frame cut through the crowd like a ship through still water. And he was so impossibly, unbelievably, incomprehensibly large that her brain simply refused to process what her eyes were telling it. His legs were thicker than her entire torso, and his hands looked like they could wrap around her head with room to spare. And his chest was a wall of dense muscle beneath his jacket. And his jaw was squared and hard and dusted with stubble that was darker than deep space. And his boots hit the deck plating with a weight that she could feel in her teeth. Her datapad slipped from her fingers and clattered to the ground. Every file she had ever read about humans had included measurements and statistics and clinical descriptions of their physiology. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the sheer, overwhelming physical reality of one standing 3 feet away from her. Her bioluminescent markings flared bright violet, which was the Silithi equivalent of screaming internally. And she grabbed Ren's arm with both hands and pulled him close and whispered in a voice that was not remotely as quiet as she thought it was. Humano es excesivamente grande. Elias stopped walking. He turned his head, and those dark human eyes found her, and one corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile that suggested he had heard every single word, and in broken but passable Silithi, he said, "Gracias, pequeña. That is very kind of you." Kaya's markings went from violet to bright crimson, which was the Silithi equivalent of wanting to crawl into a hole and never come out. And Ren placed one hand over his face and muttered something about diplomatic incidents. The moment hung there, strange and awkward and somehow warm, the giant human looking down at the tiny alien girl who had just loudly announced his excessive size to half the market. And then every alarm on the station went off at once. The lights shifted to emergency red, and a Crethian voice boomed across the public address system with the kind of forced calm that meant things were very, very bad. Attention all personnel. Vrek Marauder vessels detected on intercept trajectory. All non-combat species report to shelters immediately. This is not a drill. The crowd erupted into panic around him, aliens scattering in every direction, and Kaya stood frozen in the middle of it all, staring up at the human who was no longer smiling. Elias Voss looked toward the docking ring, and something changed in his eyes, something old and hard and very, very dangerous. And he reached for the comm unit on his collar, and spoke in a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Torres, get the crew armed and meet me at Junction 7. We have incoming." Then he looked down at Kaya one more time, and his voice softened just slightly. "You should find that shelter, pequeña." He turned and walked toward the danger, and Kaya watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs, her markings pulsing with every shade of fear and wonder the Silithi body could produce. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a single thought formed with perfect clarity. What in the name of every star had she just gotten herself into? The alarms had not stopped screaming for 6 minutes, and in those 6 minutes, Relay Station Omega had transformed from a bustling trade hub into something that felt very much like a trap. Kaya pressed herself against the wall of the shelter corridor, surrounded by hundreds of terrified aliens. Mulvari merchants clutching their goods, Fesic diplomats folding their wings tight against their bodies, Krethian workers clicking their mandibles in rapid distress. And all of them were moving in the same direction, away from the docking ring, away from the outer hull, away from whatever was coming. But Kaya was not moving with them. She had her datapad open and was pulling every feed she could find from the station's security cameras, her fingers moving across the screen with the kind of speed that only a Salithi engineer could manage. And what she saw on those feeds made her blood run cold. 3 Vrek boarding pods had attached themselves to the station's outer hull like parasites, their serrated docking claws punching through the metal with brutal efficiency. And inside each pod were dozens of Vrek soldiers, tall reptilian creatures covered in dark green scales with yellow eyes that never blinked, and mouths full of teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The Vrek had been exiled from the Concorde 2 centuries ago for what the official records politely called persistent violations of sapient rights, and what everyone else called mass murder and pillaging on a galactic scale. And they had spent those 2 centuries getting angrier and meaner and better armed. And Relay Station Omega had exactly 0 military defenses because the Concorde believed in diplomacy and the power of strongly worded letters. Kaya, Ren grabbed her arm, his own bioluminescent markings pale with fear. We need to move to the deep shelters now. Look at this, she said, turning the datapad toward him. On the screen the human called. Elias Voss was doing something that made no sense to either of them. He was walking toward the breach points. Not running, not panicking, but walking with a steady, measured pace that spoke of absolute certainty. And behind him walked 4 other humans, his crew, and every single one of them had the same expression on their faces, a kind of cold, focused calm that looked almost peaceful if you did not notice the way their hands were already reaching for weapons. Kaya switched to the biometric overlay on her scanner and aimed it at the security feed, and the readings that came back made her gasp. His heart rate is dropping, she whispered. Ren stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Dropping, she repeated. Ren, he is walking toward armed hostiles, and his heart rate is going down, 58 beats per minute. His cortisol levels are stabilizing. His pupils are dilating, but not from fear, from focus. His body is literally optimizing itself for combat in real time. That is not possible, Ren said. I am looking at the data, Kaya said. His species does this. When they face danger, their bodies do not flood with panic. They enter a state of, I do not even have a Salithi word for it, controlled aggression, like their biology has a mode specifically designed for violence, and it activates when they are threatened. On the feed, Elias reached the main corridor leading to Docking Bay 7, and he stopped in front of a cargo container that weighed roughly 800 kilograms according to the manifest tag visible on its side. And he planted his feet, and gripped the bottom edge, and lifted. He lifted it off the ground, muscles standing out like cables beneath his jacket, veins rising along his forearms, his jaw clenched tight, and he dragged it across the corridor and set it down as a barricade with a crash that shook the camera. Kaya's markings went bright white, which was the Salithi equivalent of a gasp. Pure disbelief. 3 of our dock workers could not move that container this morning, she said in a voice that had gone very quiet. I watched them try for 20 minutes before they brought a hover loader. Kaya, we need to go, Ren said again, pulling harder on her arm. No, she said, and the word came out with a firmness that surprised both of them. I need to understand what they are. She pulled up the Concorde's planetary classification database and searched for Earth, and the file that came back was stamped with a designation she had only ever seen in textbooks about uninhabitable worlds. Class 12 Death World. High gravity, almost 10 meters per second squared at the surface, which was nearly double the galactic average for sapient homeworlds, and the atmosphere was 21% oxygen, which most species considered a corrosive toxic gas at that concentration. And the planet had active tectonic plates and massive oceans of salt water, and weather systems that included electrical storms and frozen water falling from the sky, and surface temperatures that ranged from -90 to +50 degrees across the globe. And the wildlife, the file on Earth's wildlife, was longer than the files on some entire civilizations, filled with creatures that had claws and fangs and venom and armor and every conceivable weapon that evolution could design. And the humans had not just survived among them, they had conquered every single one. They were persistence predators, the file said, which meant they did not rely on speed or strength or venom to catch their prey. They simply followed it, walking and jogging at a pace they could maintain for hours and hours and hours, until the animal they were chasing collapsed from exhaustion, and then they killed it. Kaya read that sentence 3 times because she was certain she had misunderstood it. She had not misunderstood it. A sound like thunder pulled her attention back to the security feed, and what she saw next would stay with her for the rest of her life. The first Vrek boarding pod had opened, and a squad of 8 Vrek soldiers poured into the corridor, plasma rifles raised, their scaled bodies moving with the quick, darting aggression of born predators. And they rounded the corner, expecting to find empty hallways and frightened civilians. Instead, they found Elias Voss standing behind his barricade, with a ballistic rifle braced against his shoulder, and that same terrifying calm written across every line of his face. The Vrek squad leader hesitated for exactly 1 second, because even a Vrek knew when something did not feel right. And in that 1 second, Elias opened fire. The sound was different from plasma weapons, not a hiss or a whine, but a sharp percussive crack that echoed through the metal corridors like a hammer striking an anvil. And the first 2 Vrek went down before the others even registered what was happening. The remaining Vrek returned fire, and plasma bolts scorched the air around Elias, melting gouges in the barricade and the walls, and one bolt grazed his left arm and burned through his jacket sleeve and left a red welt across his skin that would have sent any Silithi into immediate shock. Elias did not even flinch. He shifted his position, fired 3 more times, and dropped a 3rd Vrek. And then a 4th rushed the barricade with a curved blade drawn. And what happened next was something Kaya would later describe in her research notes as the single most terrifying display of physical capability she had ever witnessed from any sapient being. Elias caught the Vrek's blade arm, twisted it sideways with a sharp motion that produced a sound like cracking wood, and then drove his reinforced gauntlet into the creature's chestplate with enough force to shatter the natural armor that was supposed to be strong enough to stop a low-caliber projectile. The Vrek crumpled to the ground and did not get up. The remaining soldiers broke and ran back toward their boarding pod, because the Vrek were raiders who preyed on weak and defenseless targets, and whatever this creature was, it was neither weak nor defenseless, and their training had not prepared them for anything like it. Elias stood in the corridor surrounded by fallen enemies, breathing hard, blood running down his left arm from the plasma burn, and he looked directly into the security camera as if he somehow knew someone was watching. Kaya realized she had stopped breathing. Her bioluminescent markings were cycling through colors so fast they were almost strobing, white to violet to gold to white again, and her hands were shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the datapad. Ren was staring at the screen over her shoulder, and for the first time in her life, Kaya saw her brother completely and utterly speechless. "What?" whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarms still blaring throughout the station, her eyes wide and her markings pulsing like twin stars embedded in her skin. "What are they?" She did not mean it as a question about biology or classification or planetary origin. She meant it as a question about how the galaxy had managed to overlook something this extraordinary for so long. And somewhere in the back of her brilliant racing mind, a decision was forming, not yet fully shaped, not yet spoken aloud, but growing with every heartbeat. She was not going to the shelter. She was going to find the human. Kaya found him on deck 14, sitting on an ammunition crate with his back against the wall, and a field medic kit open on his lap, and he was stitching his own arm shut with a needle and thread, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. She stopped at the end of the corridor and stared, because the plasma burn on his left arm was ugly and raw, and would have required immediate hospitalization for any Salithi. And this man was sewing it closed with his own hands, while his crew stood guard at either end of the hallway. "You should not be here," Elias said without looking up, pulling the thread tight with a small grunt that was the only indication he could even feel the pain. "You should not be stitching your own wound with what appears to be fishing line," Kaya replied, stepping closer despite every survival instinct in her body telling her to maintain a safe distance from the largest predator she had ever encountered. Elias glanced up at her, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that the tiny lavender alien from the market had come to find him, instead of hiding in a shelter like everyone else on the station. "It is surgical thread," he said. "It looks like fishing line." "It is surgical thread that looks like fishing line," he admitted, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Kaya pulled out her datapad and scanned his arm before he could protest, and the readings made her bioluminescent markings flicker gold with scientific excitement that temporarily overrode her fear. "Your tissue is already regenerating," she said. "The wound margin is closing at a rate of approximately 2 millimeters per hour. That is 17 times faster than Salithi baseline healing. And your white blood cell count has tripled in the affected area in less than 30 minutes. "Is that good?" Elias asked. "That is terrifying," Kaya said. "Catastrophic tissue damage, the way mine treats a small scratch." She looked up at him, this mountain of a creature sitting before her, and she was suddenly very aware of how small she was next to him. Her head barely reached his chest even when he was sitting down, and his hands could have wrapped around both of hers with room to spare, and the heat radiating from his body was noticeable from 2 feet away, because humans apparently ran at a core temperature that would constitute a dangerous fever for most galactic species. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, and his voice was not unkind, but it carried the weight of someone who had more important things to deal with than a curious scientist. "Because you need me," Kaya said. That got his full attention. She held up her datapad and projected a holographic schematic of the station into the air between them, the blue light reflecting off her lavender skin and making her markings glow brighter. "Control the docking ring, and they are pushing toward engineering," she said, her voice shifting from nervous to focused as she entered the territory she knew best. Technical analysis, problem solving, the beautiful, clean logic of systems and structures. If they reach the main reactor, they can cut power to the entire station, and we will be blind and helpless in the dark. "We know this," Elias said. "What you do not know," Kaya continued, "is that this station runs on Salithi-designed Helion reactors, and I wrote my graduate thesis on their emergency shutdown protocols. And the maintenance tunnels that connect every major system on this station are Salithi scale, which means they are approximately 1 meter in diameter, which means you cannot fit inside them, but I can." Elias looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the holographic map, then looked back at her. You want to crawl through maintenance tunnels in a station that is being invaded by Vrek raiders, he said. I want to help save this station, Kaya said, and you need someone who understands these systems, because, with respect, Commander, you are very good at hitting things, but the Helion reactor will not respond to being hit. Torres, who had been listening from his guard position, let out a short laugh that he quickly disguised as a cough. Elias studied the small alien woman standing before him, with her chin raised, and her markings blazing with determination, and her hands trembling only slightly at her sides. And he recognized something in her that he had seen in the best soldiers he had ever served with. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Kaya Velshara." "All right, Kaya Velshara," he said, pushing himself to his feet and towering over her like a cliff face over a tide pool. "Show me what you have in mind." They moved together through the station's inner corridors. The strangest partnership either of them had ever been part of. The massive human and the tiny Silithi, moving in tandem through dark hallways lit only by emergency strips and the soft glow of Kaya's bioluminescent markings. They reached a sealed bulkhead that blocked access to the reactor section, its locking mechanism fused by a Vrek plasma charge, and Kaya examined it with her scanner and shook her head. "The electronic lock is destroyed," she said. "We would need a cutting torch to get through, and we do not have one." Elias stepped forward, gripped the manual release handle, a thick metal bar designed to be operated by 3 Krethian workers simultaneously, and pulled. The metal screamed as it bent, and the bulkhead groaned, and with a sound like a giant exhaling, the door lurched open 6 inches, then a foot, then enough for them to pass through. And Elias stood there, holding it open with both arms, muscles rigid under his skin, veins standing out along his neck. "Go," he said through gritted teeth. Kaya ducked under his arm and through the gap, her markings flickering with that same white disbelief she had felt watching him on the security cameras. And she could feel the heat pouring off his body as she passed, could smell something metallic and warm that she would later learn was the scent of human exertion. As they pressed deeper into the station, Kaya talked to fill the silence and settle her nerves. And Elias listened. She told him about the Silithi, how her people were physically the most fragile sapient species in the Concord, how their bones were hollow like a bird's, and their muscles were efficient but weak, how a fall from a height that a human child would laugh off could kill an adult Silithi, and how this fragility had shaped their entire civilization into one built around avoidance and caution, and the worship of the mind over the body. "We are brilliant," she said, and it was not arrogance, but simple fact. "We have designed half the technology the Concord uses, reactors, navigation systems, communication arrays, but we have always depended on other species for protection, because we cannot protect ourselves, and honestly, I think it has made us cowards." "Being careful is not the same as being a coward," Elias said. "No," Kaya agreed, "but hiding in a shelter while someone else fights for your survival is." Elias told her about Earth in return, about the oceans and the mountains, and the storms that could flatten entire cities, about the predators that had hunted his ancestors across savannas millions of years ago, about how humans had survived not by being the fastest or the strongest, but by simply refusing to stop. "We are persistent predators," he said. "We would chase an animal for 20, 30, sometimes 50 kilometers across open ground under a sun hot enough to cook meat on bare rock, and we would just keep going, hour after hour, until then animal's body gave out and it collapsed, and then we would eat it." Kaya stared at him with her mouth slightly open. "That is the most horrifying thing I have ever heard," she said. "I know," he said. "We made a whole holiday around it, called a marathon." They reached a junction where the corridors split in 3 directions, and Kaya was consulting her map when a shape lunged from the shadows. A Vrek soldier, wounded and half-mad, its plasma pistol raised and firing wildly. Elias moved faster than something his size should have been able to move, and he threw himself between Kaya and the blast, and the plasma bolt struck him across the back, and burned through his jacket, and seared a line of scorched flesh across his shoulder blade. And he let out a sound that was more anger than pain, and drove his fist into the wreck's skull with a single devastating strike that dropped the creature to the floor. He stood there breathing hard, the smell of his own burned skin filling the corridor, and Kaya rushed to him, with her scanner already active. "You are insane," she said, her voice cracking, her hands pressing against his back as she assessed the damage. "You put your body between me and a plasma weapon. Your flesh is not plasma-resistant. I should not have to explain this to you." "You are welcome," Elias said. She treated the burn with the supplies from his kit, and as she worked, she could feel the impossible heat of his skin, the solidity of him, the way his muscles moved like machinery beneath her small hands, and she could see the edges of the wound, already beginning to change color, as his body started its furious biological repair process. "You are excessivamente grande," she said softly, and this time the words carried no shock and no embarrassment, only a quiet wonder that sat warm and steady in her chest. "In every way." Elias looked over his shoulder at her, and for a moment the soldier was gone, and there was just a man looking at someone who had chosen to stand beside him when the entire galaxy was running away. "And you are the bravest small person I have ever met," he said. Kaya's markings glowed warm gold, and she did not look away. Then she straightened up and pulled the schematic back onto her datapad, and said, "The secondary reactor is 2 levels down, and if I can access it through the maintenance shaft at Junction 9, I can reroute power to the defense grid and lock the Vrek out of engineering permanently." "What is the catch?" Elias asked. Kaya hesitated for just a moment, her markings dimming slightly. "The secondary reactor is in the docking ring," she said, "which is completely under Vrek control. And if we want to do something more permanent than rerouting power, if we want to destroy their ships and end this, someone would have to trigger a controlled overload from inside the reactor chamber." "Inside the blast zone," Elias. "Inside the blast zone," Kaya confirmed. They looked at each other in the dim red emergency light, the human and the alien, the giant and the small one, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. But they were both thinking it. The plan was simple in the way that all terrible plans were simple. Get to the secondary reactor, trigger a controlled overload, destroy the Vrek ships attached to the docking ring, and get out before the explosion turned everything within 200 meters into superheated gas. The problem was the getting out part. Elias laid it out for his crew in the forward command post they had established on Deck 12, drawing lines on the holographic map with his finger, while Torres and the others listened with the grim focus of people who understood exactly how bad things were. "The corridor to the secondary reactor runs through 3 Vrek-held sections," he said. "Radiation levels in the reactor approach corridor are already elevated because the Vrek damaged the shielding when they breached the hull. This means whoever goes in there will be absorbing enough rads to make a Thesic drop dead in 4 minutes." "And a human?" Torres asked. "In that environment for approximately 20 minutes before performance degradation begins," Kaya said from her position at the edge of the group, her datapad projecting biological readouts that the human crew members could not fully understand, but that painted a clear enough picture. "Your species has a significantly higher tolerance for ionizing radiation than any Concord species, partly because of your cellular repair mechanisms, and partly because your planet's magnetic field was apparently not very good at its job. She is saying we are radiation resistant because Earth was trying to kill us and we adapted," Elias translated. "I am saying exactly that," Kaya confirmed. "I will go," Elias said, and he said it the way he said everything important, flatly, without drama, as if he were announcing he was going to get a cup of coffee. Torres stepped forward immediately, Commander, with respect, the reactor approach is flooded with enough radiation to kill anyone in this crew except possibly me, Elias said. And I am the only one with enough mass to force through the debris blocking Corridor 7. And we are not having a debate about this. The reactor's failsafe requires Sci-Fi biometric authorization, Kaya said, and every head in the room turned toward her. A genetic lock keyed to Sci-Fi DNA, specifically the bioluminescent markers in the epidermis, which means you cannot trigger the overload without a Sci-Fi present. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room realizes the same terrible thing at the same moment. No, Elias said. You do not get to say no, Kaya said. You will die in that radiation in 4 minutes. Then we had better be fast. I am not taking you into that corridor. Kaya stood up to her full height of 4 feet and 2 inches, and looked up at the 6'4" human towering over her, and said in a voice that did not shake, even slightly, "You are big, not in charge of me." Torres made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a prayer. Elias looked down at her, this impossibly small creature with glowing skin and luminous eyes, and the kind of stubborn courage that no amount of physical fragility could diminish. And he saw in her expression that there was no argument he could make that would change her mind, because she had already done the math, and the math said she was necessary, and Kaya Velshara was not the kind of person who let someone else die because she was afraid. "If I tell you to run," he said quietly, "you run." "If you tell me to run," she said, "I will consider it, and then make my own decision." They left the command post together, and moved through the station's inner corridors toward the docking ring, and with every step, the temperature rose, and the air took on a metallic taste, and Kaya's datapad showed the radiation levels climbing in steady increments that made her stomach tight with fear she refused to show. They encountered the first wreck patrol at the junction of corridors 7 and 9, 4 soldiers guarding the approach to the reactor section, and Elias did not slow down or hesitate or make a plan. He just walked around the corner and started killing them. It was not elegant or theatrical. It was fast and brutal and efficient in the way that only a creature bred by millions of years of evolutionary violence could be. And Kaya pressed herself against the wall and watched as Elias moved through the wrecked soldiers like a force of nature, his rifle barking in short controlled bursts, his body absorbing hits that would have shattered Sci-Fi bones, his boots never stopping their forward momentum. One wreck charged him with a blade, and Elias caught the creature by the throat with one hand, and lifted it off the ground and threw it into the wall, hard enough to crack the metal plating, and the sound it made was something Kaya would hear in her dreams for years. When it was over, Elias stood in the corridor, with 4 bodies at his feet, and blood running from a cut above his eye, and plasma burns on both arms, and his breathing slightly elevated, but his hands perfectly steady. And he looked back at Kaya and said, "Clear." She stepped over the fallen wreck, on legs that were shaking, and joined him, and they pressed forward into the reactor section. The radiation hit Kaya like a wall of invisible fire. She could not feel it exactly, but her datapad screamed warnings, and her markings began to flicker erratically, disrupted by the ionizing particles bombarding her cellular structure. And she knew with cold scientific certainty that she had maybe 6 minutes before her body started shutting down. Elias noticed the change in her markings immediately. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough," she lied. They reached the reactor chamber, a vast cylindrical space dominated by the glowing blue core of the Helion reactor, its containment rings spinning in slow hypnotic circles, and the air hummed with energy that Kaya could feel in her teeth and her bones and the deepest parts of her cellular structure. She ran to the control console and began the overload sequence, her fingers flying across interfaces designed for Sci-Fi hands, and the biometric scanner read her bioluminescent markers and accepted her authorization. and the reactor began to build toward critical mass. 90 seconds once I confirm the final sequence, she said. We need to be past the blast doors before. A sound like grinding metal filled the chamber, and they both turned. The Vrek commander stood in the far doorway. He was enormous, the largest Vrek Kaya had ever seen or ever heard of. Nearly 7 feet tall, with scales so dark they were almost black, and a scar running across his face that had taken one of his yellow eyes and left a dead white socket in its place, and he carried a massive curved blade in each hand, and his remaining eye burned with the kind of hatred that went beyond strategy into something personal and primal. He looked at Elias, and Elias looked at him, and something passed between them that transcended species and language. A recognition between two apex predators that there was only room for one of them in this space. The Vrek commander charged. Elias met him in the center of the chamber, and the impact of their collision shook the floor plates hard enough to knock Kaya off her feet. And what followed was the most savage display of combat she had ever witnessed. Two massive creatures tearing into each other with everything they had, fists and blades and teeth and raw biological fury. The Vrek was faster. His blade sliced across Elias's torso and opened a gash along his ribs that bled freely, and his scaled fists hit like battering rams, snapping Elias's head sideways and driving him back, step by step. But Elias did not fall. He took every hit and kept coming, kept pressing forward, kept fighting with a relentlessness that the Vrek had never encountered in any prey species it had ever hunted. Because the Vrek was built for explosive power, for quick, overwhelming violence, and humans were not built for that. Humans were built to endure. The fight lasted 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes, the Vrek commander threw everything he had at the human, speed and strength and blade work and rage, and Elias absorbed it all, bleeding from a dozen wounds, one eye swelling shut, ribs cracked, still standing, still moving forward, still refusing to stop. And the Vrek began to slow. Its movements became sluggish, its breathing ragged, its single eye wide with something that looked very much like disbelief, because no creature it had ever fought had lasted this long, and the human was still coming, still standing, still looking at it with those dark, steady eyes. Elias caught the Vrek's blade arm on the final swing, twisted it until something inside the joint snapped with a wet pop, and drove his forehead into the commander's face with a headbutt that cracked the heavy scales across its skull. The Vrek dropped to its knees. Elias hit it once more, and it fell. "Now!" Kaya screamed from the console, slamming her hand down on the final confirmation, and the reactor's hum rose to a shriek, and the countdown began. 90 seconds. Elias turned toward her, and he was a ruin, bleeding and broken and barely standing, one arm hanging wrong at his side, his face a mask of blood and sweat, and something fierce and unbreakable. He crossed the chamber in 4 strides and scooped Kaya up with his one working arm, pulling her against his chest like she weighed nothing, which to him she basically did, and he ran. He ran through corridors flooded with radiation that was now spiking toward lethal levels, his boots pounding the deck plating with a rhythm that matched Kaya's hammering heart, and she clung to him with both arms wrapped around his neck, her face pressed against his chest, her bioluminescent markings blazing so bright they lit the dark corridors like a beacon. She was his light, and he was her shield, and they ran together through the dying station as the reactor behind them screamed toward detonation. 40 seconds, 30 seconds, 20 seconds. The blast doors were ahead, massive reinforced barriers designed to contain reactor breaches, and they were already closing, the gap narrowing inch by inch as the automated safety systems kicked in. Elias threw himself forward, tucking Kaya against his body, and they slid through the gap with less than a foot to spare, and the doors slammed shut behind them with a sound like the end of the world. 5 seconds later, the secondary reactor went critical. The explosion tore through the docking ring like a fist through paper, consuming the wrecked ships and boarding pods and every hostile that had not already fled. And the shockwave hit the blast doors with enough force to rattle Kaya's teeth inside her skull, even through the reinforced barrier. Then silence. Elias was on the floor, his back against the wall, Kaya still cradled against his chest, and he was breathing in long, ragged gasps that she could feel through her entire body. And his blood was soaking into her clothes, warm and copper-scented, and very, very real. She looked up at him, tiny in his arms, her markings pulsing with slow, exhausted gold, and his face was battered and swollen, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You are so stupidly, recklessly, beautifully big," she whispered. He laughed, and it turned into a wince, and he looked down at her with his one good eye and said, "And you are the smallest person who ever saved my life." Her markings flickered warm, amber, and she did not let go of him, and he did not let go of her, and they sat together on the cold metal floor, while the echoes of the explosion faded into nothing, and the alarms finally went quiet. 3 weeks passed, and the galaxy could not stop talking about what had happened at Relay Station Omega. The footage had spread across the galactic communication network like wildfire through dry grass. Security camera recordings of a single human fighting wrecked soldiers in narrow corridors, lifting cargo containers bare-handed, taking plasma burns and blade wounds and radiation exposure and refusing to fall. And the final recording from the reactor chamber where Commander Elias Voss had fought the Vrek commander hand-to-hand and won through nothing more than the stubborn biological refusal to stop. Every species in the Concord watched it, and every species had a different reaction. The Thesic were horrified, their hollow-boned bodies shuddering at the violence, their diplomatic councils releasing statements about the dangers of integrating such a volatile species into civilized society. And they proposed increased restrictions on human movement within Concord. The Mulvari were fascinated, their scientists flooding the galactic research archives with requests for human biological data, publishing papers with titles like Persistence Predation and its Implications for Interspecies Conflict Resolution, and Extreme Homeworld Adaptation, a case study in Class 12 Deathworld Sapiens. The Krethians were quiet, which was unusual for a species that normally had an opinion about everything, and their silence spoke louder than any statement. Because the Krethian administrator of Relay Station Omega, a tall, thin insectoid named Sethic, who had watched his station nearly fall to raiders while his own people hid in shelters, had already made up his mind about what needed to happen next. He called for a summit. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Interstellar Concord was a massive domed chamber on the capital station of Nexus Prime, with tiered seating arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking platform, and on the day of the summit, every single one of those seats was filled. 43 species, thousands of delegates, millions of viewers watching across the network, and at the center of it all, a question that had been quietly avoided for 11 years. What were humans, and what role should they play in the future of the Concord? Elias was there, though he would have preferred to be almost anywhere else. He sat in the human delegation section, wearing his dress uniform, with his arm in a regeneration sleeve, and his ribs wrapped, and the bruises on his face faded to yellow-green shadows. And he looked deeply uncomfortable in the way that soldiers always looked when they were forced to sit in political assemblies instead of doing something useful. Torres sat beside him, equally uncomfortable, and whispered, "If anyone asks me to give a speech, I'm deserting." "Noted," Elias said. The summit opened with Administrator Sethic presenting the official report of the battle. Of Relay Station Omega, the Vrek incursion, the civilian casualties, the failure of Concord security protocols, and the actions of the human crew of the ISV Perseverance that had ultimately saved the station and everyone on it. The report was clinical and factual and devastating in its implications, because what it showed, without explicitly saying, was that the entire defensive philosophy of the Concorde, diplomacy first, military strength unnecessary, had almost gotten 20,000 beings killed. Then Sethik made his proposal. "I formally recommend," he said, his mandibles clicking with careful precision, "that the species designation of Homo sapiens be elevated from provisional member to full military partner within the interstellar Concorde, with all rights, responsibilities, and strategic authority that designation entails." The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted and clicked and whistled and hummed in every language the galaxy had ever produced. The translation systems struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of opinion flooding the room, and the Thessic ambassador stood and spread her wings in the formal gesture of objection, and declared that granting military authority to a Death-World species was tantamount to handing a loaded weapon to a child. The debate raged for 2 hours, growing more heated with every passing minute, factions forming and dissolving, old prejudices surfacing alongside genuine concerns, and the human delegation sat quietly through all of it, because Elias had instructed them to say nothing and let the galaxy argue with itself. Then the moderator called the final witness, and every voice in the chamber fell silent. Kaya Velshara walked to the central platform. She was the smallest person in the room by a considerable margin. 4 feet and 2 inches of lavender skin, and luminous amber eyes, and bioluminescent markings that pulsed with a steady calm rhythm that belied the hammering of her heart, and she wore the formal white robes of a Salithi academic with a small pin on her collar that Elias recognized as the engineering insignia of Relay Station Omega. She looked out at the assembly, thousands of faces, dozens of species, the combined political power of the known galaxy, and she did not flinch. "My name is Kaya Velshara," she said, and her voice carried clear and steady through the chamber's amplification system. "I am a xenobiologist, and 3 weeks ago I was present during the Vrek attack on Relay Station Omega, and I am here to tell you what I saw." She paused, and the silence was absolute. "I saw a human being lift a cargo container that 3 Salithi workers could not move," she said. "I saw a human being walk toward armed hostiles while his heart rate dropped, because his body was designed by a world so dangerous that it built a calm response into the biology of its children, not a panic response. Them killed before they ever built their first fire. I saw a human being take a plasma bolt across his back and keep moving. Saw his wounds begin to heal before I had finished scanning them. Saw him fight a creature twice his speed with nothing but endurance and will and the simple refusal to stop. I ran biometric scans, and I read the files, and I learned that humans come from a world with gravity that would crush Salithi bones, an atmosphere that would poison Thessic lungs, temperature extremes that would kill Molvari in minutes, and predators so numerous and so deadly that the evolutionary response was not to hide or to flee, but to stand up on 2 legs and chase them across open ground until they collapsed. Her markings brightened, gold and warm, and she looked directly at the Thessic ambassador who had called humans dangerous. "You are right to be afraid," Kaya said. "I was afraid. And I am a scientist who thought she understood what humans were from reading files, and I was not even close to understanding, because the files tell you the measurements and the statistics, but they do not tell you what it feels like to stand next to one, to feel the ground shake when they walk, to watch them bleed and break and get back up, as if pain is just information their body processes and discards. They are excessivamente grande, excessively large, excessively strong, excessively durable, excessively everything. and I understand why that frightens you." She turned slowly, looking at every section of the assembly. "But here is what the files do not tell you, and what I learned in those corridors. When the plasma bolt came for me, the human did not calculate whether I was strategically valuable. He did not weigh the cost of injury against the benefit of my survival. He did not consider for even 1 second whether a small Salithi woman he had met 2 hours ago was worth taking a wound for. He simply put his body between me and the fire. Because that is what humans do. They protect, not because it is logical, not because it is efficient, but because something in the core of their biology, something forged on that terrible, beautiful death world, tells them that the strong shield the weak, and the big protect the small, and they will break themselves to pieces doing it, without ever asking for anything in return." Kaya's voice grew stronger, her markings blazing now with a light that filled the platform like a small sun. "You ask whether humans should be given military authority in this Concord, and I tell you that the question is wrong, because the question assumes that power is dangerous, and power is only dangerous in the hands of those who do not care about the people they have power over. I have seen what humans do with their strength, and they do not use it to dominate, they use it to shield. And if this Concord cannot recognize the difference between a predator that hunts the weak, a guardian that protects them, then we do not deserve the protection we are being offered." She looked toward the human delegation, and her eyes found Elias, and he was looking back at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between pride and gratitude, and a warmth that crossed every boundary of species and biology, and the vast dark distance between their worlds. "They are Excesivamente Grande," Kaya said, her voice quiet now, but carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "Not just in body, not just in strength, but in heart, in will, in everything they choose to be. And I believe we are small, not because of our size, but because we never had the courage to stand beside them." She paused. "Until now." She stepped back from the platform, and for 3 seconds the Grand Assembly Hall was perfectly silent. Then the Molvari delegation began to stomp their feet, which was their species form of applause, and the Crethians clicked their mandibles in rapid approval, and one by one the other delegations joined in, a rising wave of sound that built and built until the chamber was shaking with it. The vote was called. The motion passed. Humanity was formally welcomed as a full military partner of the Interstellar Concord, and when the result was announced, Elias closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 11 years. Later, after the speeches and the ceremonies and the endless diplomatic handshaking that Elias endured with visible discomfort, the ISV Perseverance sat in its docking cradle at Relay Station Omega, repaired and refueled and ready to fly. Elias stood at the airlock, running through his pre-departure checklist when he heard footsteps, small ones, light as rain on glass, and he looked up to see Kaya walking toward him, carrying a bag that was almost as big as she was. She stopped in front of him and held up a data chip. "Orders," she said. "Approved by the Concord Science Division this morning. Xenobiology liaison assigned to the ISV Perseverance for an indefinite research posting." Elias looked at the chip, then at her, then at the bag. "Does your brother know about this?" he asked. Ren's exact words were, and I am translating loosely, that I have lost my mind, and that he blames you personally for corrupting his sister with your Death World recklessness. So, he took it well? He threatened to file a formal complaint with the Concord, and then he hugged me and told me to be careful. So yes, relatively well by Ren standards. Elias looked down at her, this tiny, brilliant, stubborn, impossible woman who had followed him into radiation and fire, and had stood before the entire galaxy and spoken words that changed the course of history. And something shifted in his chest, something warm and unfamiliar, and excessivamente grande in a way that had nothing to do with physical. He extended his hand, massive, scarred, rough with calluses from a lifetime of hard work and harder fighting. She took it, small, lavender, delicate, her bioluminescent markings glowing steady gold against his skin. "Ready, small one?" he asked. "Do not call me that, giant," she said. He smiled, and she smiled, and they walked aboard together, and the airlock closed behind them with a soft hiss. The ISV Perseverance undocked from Relay Station Omega, and turned its nose toward open space, and the stars stretched out before it like an invitation written in light. And somewhere inside the ship, a very large human and a very small alien stood side by side at the viewport, and watched the galaxy unfold. The universe had spent a very long time believing that greatness was measured in intellect, in elegance, in the quiet refinement of civilizations that had never needed to fight for survival. It took a death worlder from a broken, dangerous place. Beautiful world, and the smallest, bravest woman in the galaxy, standing beside him to teach them all that sometimes greatness is not measured in what you are. It is measured in what you are willing to become for someone else. And that kind of greatness has no size at all. Or perhaps it is excessivamente grande. And it always will be.